Before we hop into this episode, I have one favor to ask of you. If you've got any kind of information or inspiration from this podcast, it would mean the world to me if you hit the subscribe button. Just like most podcasts out there are more people that watch this show that are not subscribed than that are subscribed. And so if you want to help me get bigger and better guests for this show as we go along, and I hope you do stick along, it would mean the world to me to hit that subscribe button so that we can make it happen. Thank you. Let's get into the interview. Why should we stop being so kind to our future selves?
So, everything in this book is really heartfelt in the sense that I have sort of reached these conclusions through living it and through experiencing it. But there is also, in the way I phrase it, I'm also sometimes kind of pursuing various vendettas against conventional self-help and productivity advice. And that phrasing is one example of that. There's a great amount of work, and some of it's very good work, on the idea that personal development and making a sort of positive change to your life is all about thinking about your future self, doing things in the present that would make your future self grateful that you did them that way. So, maybe it's not super fun to get back into running, and maybe it's not super fun to deny yourself the third alcoholic drink or whatever, but your future self is going to be really grateful that you did that. And as with lots of the things I'm arguing, it's not that that's wrong. It's not that like you should pay no attention to that. But I do think that for a lot of people, I'm one of them, and I think the kind of people who are into personal development stuff in general are more likely to fall into this category. Like, very often their problem is not that they're bad at deferring gratification. Very often their problem is that they're too good at deferring gratification, at saying like, I'm so, and if you just if you put your whole effort into trying to make things good in the future, the risk is that you kind of turn yourself into somebody who sees the good stuff as always happening in the future. And you fail to realize that actually at some point, at least, you got to be doing things that bring you alive and fill you with energy and enjoyment in the present. Otherwise you never enjoy life. So in that section of the book, I mentioned the very famous marshmallow experiments. If anyone genuinely hasn't heard about them, the idea that in studies, if you give I guess it's like a 5-year-old kid a marshmallow, and you say you can either eat that marshmallow or wait 10 minutes, and then you'll get 2 marshmallows. The kids who can wait and have the discipline to deny themselves the quick gratification, this is contested, but the studies generally seem to show they have like better life outcomes. They're more successful in life, and that's like, okay, fine. But the point I make is that at some point in your later life, you've got to actually eat a marshmallow instead of always be collecting them for later. And that's definitely been like, I'm writing from what my problems have been. And my problems have certainly been more like, I'm going to be really dutiful. I'm going to store everything up. I'm going to get everything sorted out. And then you sort of like, well, yeah, but when does the bit come where you actually kind of fully dive in to life?
Yeah, it's like if you get a new pair of clothes or that cologne that you want to wear or that place that you want to go, we always put it into some desired idea of there's going to be this day when it does happen.
Yeah.
Yet we hold on to it so much and it never happens. There's a quote from your new book. You said, "We value the present solely based on how it's going to impact our future." And it was so many people, I think, if anyone that listens to a podcast, they usually are that kind of person.
Right. That's right. And I think it's, you're not going to be interested in any of this stuff if you're the kind of person who just every single day thinks the only thing worth doing is going out and getting drunk and having fun, right? I mean, it's like you're not even going to be asking the question. So I think the sort of selection bias there is such that I'm on safe ground promoting this attitude. Now, I do think there's something to be said sort of against it, which is that there is a sort of a life cycle aspect to it. And I am terribly ancient and old compared to you, and I think it is something that as you get a little bit older becomes more urgent. That sense of, this is real life, and I don't necessarily think it's wrong for people at the beginning of adulthood to pay more attention to the long future, right? Because that's where you are in the life cycle. But even then, when I look back at myself in, say, like my late teens, early 20s, when I went to university, I probably should have had a little bit more fun even then, to be honest. Because otherwise it's just like you're using up your life and it's not enjoyable enough.
I heard you say that on another podcast, and it was like a slap in the face to me a little bit because I'm similar to you, and like I said, a lot of your work really speaks deeply to me, and I think a lot of the people that listen to this podcast are probably similar to me in that respect. But there is a balance that I'm wondering how you've been able to get a hold of that. I assume when you had your son, it probably had an impact on you, but strategic underachievement, something that you've spoken about prior. So finding that balance of moving and trying to pursue while also strategic underachievement, how have you found that?
Well, to me, it's not even a balance, right? So strategic
Mm.
underachievement is a sort of joke name for the idea of like deliberately not doing certain things,
Yeah.
or not trying to optimize on those variables. And, I think the big breakthrough for me was seeing that that's just the other side of the coin of doing
Mm.
anything good, right? Is being willing to accept that you're not going to be doing all the potential uh, good things. So, you know, I don't mean that you mean this, but sometimes it's implied in the question that I'm sort of saying, well, if you want to have a peaceful and calm life, you've got to sort of aim to do a bit less than
Mhm.
someone else who is willing to be sort of stressed and busy. And I'm like, well, you got to do fewer things, but actually, I think in terms of what you can achieve, I think it's more. I mean, it's not for me to judge my own accomplishments, but I have the sense that I've become much more productive in a kind of focused way and in a way that is actually enjoyable since I became more willing to, you know, accept that that was going to be down 2 or 3 avenues and probably not down another 10 or 15 that I would be really interested in pursuing. Again, not that there aren't stages of life when experimenting with a whole lot of different things isn't the right thing to focus on. But once you get a sense from those kind of experiments that 2 or 3 of them are where your strengths and passions and enthusiasm lie, I think there's a lot to be said for sort of going down those avenues and not worrying too hard uh, about the others. You mentioned my becoming a parent, right? Our son is 7, and I don't think it's necessarily that you have a completely different experience as a parent. It's just that certain facts about time that are always true for everyone become really hard to ignore.
Yeah.
Like, you know, actually, I don't get to choose every single thing about how the day unfolds, especially when a child is like 0 and 1 and 2. And actually, I don't necessarily want to have total control over my time. There's something very, very beautiful and lovely about sort of being pulled into that kind of situation and not having as much choice about it. So it throws your all your preconceptions up in the air a bit.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a really routine oriented person, and your idea on interruptions was like a such a perspective shift for me that I absolutely loved, because I think a lot of what life is the unexpected is what makes life life. And if every day is a similar pattern of pursuit, I mean, where is I mean, that's kind of what your work is, right? Is getting people out of that pursuit of just doing to do, but rather to make sure that the things that you are doing is meaningful to you.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that the thing about interruptions, I was really struck. There's a quote in the book that I use from C.S. Lewis. I'm really struck by this quote. Um, Obviously, he saw it in religious terms. I don't think one has to, but he says, it's very easy to go through life thinking of everything that happens to you. I'm paraphrasing, but thinking of everything that happens to you as an interruption from your quote real or own life. When, of course, the truth, he says, is that the interruptions are precisely the real life that God is sending you day by day. That's his phrasing. And I think that basic idea of like how easy it is to go through life thinking like, this isn't the real thing, and this problem I have to deal with today is not the real thing. But if I can just get past all these real things, all these unreal things, I will get to the real bit. I think it's very tempting for people at all stages of life. And one of the examples I give is like, okay, it's good to have an organized schedule and to plan your day out. But if I'm you know I work from home, if I'm working from home on a day that it isn't my turn to pick up my son from school, and I'm just working away, and then he sort of bursts into the room to tell me something great that happened at school that day, like, if my productivity system makes that into a huge problem because that was supposed to be deep focus hour and now like it's all gone wrong, like something is up with my productivity system there, right? Because like actually that was a perfectly nice encounter. It's the kind of thing life is about. And I don't think it's only a parenting point. I think it's like you don't want to organize your life in such a way that you're not there for anything that is outside your control, because business opportunities can be outside your control. Romantic relationships can emerge from encounters outside your control. Like a million different things can happen outside your control, and so you don't want to be in total control of how your time is unfolding.
Yeah, I'm gonna say like a billion quotes throughout this podcast from the new book, especially. The more that you try to manage your time in pursuit of control, the more empty life gets, and I think that that's an amazing example of what you just said. There is we are trying to do it way too much. When even the thought of we have control of our time is an illusion to begin with.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it depends exactly what you mean, but basically, like you're just here. I use this a metaphor of like being human is just like you're in a little kayak on a sort of
Yes.
on a river, and you've got to just sort of steer as best you can, and you can navigate a bit, but you don't know what's coming next, and it's all very vulnerable and sort of risky. What we really want is to be on some sort of massive 120-foot super yacht that's got like 3 decks, and we're up on the bridge, which is all really silent and air conditioned, and we're just plotting our route into the computer and then sitting back and it's all happening. And it's like that level of control over how your life unfolds just isn't something that humans get to have. And as you point out in your question, it's like it's not actually something you'd want either. I was really influenced in writing this book by a German academic called Hartmut Rosa, who wrote a very big book called Resonance, where he argues that like most of the good stuff in life comes from a sort of relationship to the world that he calls resonance. So it's like it's that feeling of being alive, that feeling that like you're really present and you've got energy and life is kind of vivid. And yet most of the things we do as societies and individuals to try to increase control over the world actually kind of squeeze that out. And so it's just a very obvious point really when you stop to think about it. But like, if you go to a soccer match and you have control over who's going to win it, it's no fun at all. If you go to if you play a board game with someone and you're absolutely confident of the outcome, that is a useless thing. If you're interested in studying some new skill or some area of scholarship and you already know everything about it, like the fun is gone. So actually that sort of degree of lack of control, of not knowing how things will turn out or what else there is really part of, I think it's true of other friendships and relationships too, right? Actually, you don't want to get to the bit where you know your friend, let alone your spouse, so well that you can predict their every single move. Like that would be bad. That would not be good. So I think, like being a little more open to the lack of control that we have as humans is a big part of this.
The kayak and super yacht was, I think it was day 2, maybe it was, but I absolutely love that perspective. Because we think that the more that we attain, the more that we do, the more control that we have, but life is so unexpected, and I think that's what makes life life. I heard a example once where someone said, if you knew how every day was going to go and you knew how every day was going to end, would you even really want to live at that point? Because it's not life anymore. It's just kind of like this simulation where we feel, and that's what a lot of us really do to ourselves when it comes to work. When we're trying to be productive, we create the simulation of the Pomodoro technique, and we're always looking for these tactics to be as efficient as we can be, when that's not really the right game to play. And there was a moment for you that you realized that, where you weren't doing any wrong tactics, but it was kind of playing the wrong game. Is
I feel like there's been a couple of moments, so I don't know if I'm going to talk about the one that you're referring to, but I mean, yeah, let me give you sort of two little things that spring to mind. One, in my previous book, 4,000 Weeks, I wrote about this moment on a park bench in Brooklyn where we lived at the time, where I was trying to figure out like what I was even more stressed than usual by all the work I had to do. I was working as a journalist, had like more deadlines to meet by the end of that week than I could ever see how I was going to meet. And I was sitting there on the bench on the way to work, my workspace, thinking like what combination of techniques can I use? How many sort of normal functions of life can I cancel this week to sort of force all this stuff in and get to the end of it all? And just really being struck by this thought, like, oh, it's impossible. I'm trying to do something that isn't possible. And just finding that to be a very, very liberating thought, not a depressing thought. Because it's like, oh, well, if it's impossible, I don't need to beat myself up about not being able to do it. I can just sort of dive into what feels most important or even most appetizing, and lose this whole fight where I'm trying to make myself superhuman. There's also, I write in the new book about this thing where, and this maybe speaks a bit more to the sort of resonance and control side of it, I have had plenty of experience, as I'm sure some people listening to this have as well, and maybe you, of sort of, you've got a lot of freedom over your autonomy over your time. Not everyone does, but say you do. And you construct this whole sort of incredibly rigid, ambitious schedule for how you're going to spend the next week. It's like, you're going to do this at this time, this at this time. And like, it's so exciting if you're that kind of person, when you're putting that schedule together and like you stick it up on the wall or it's on the computer, whatever. Then like one day later, you're just like, oh my God, this is awful. Like I feel like I'm in jail. I've got to like do this whole thing that I told myself I'd do. And I think that is what you're getting at, right? That sort of the lifelessness that is there. I wonder if the quote you referred to just before is Alan Watts, because he says something like that at some point, about how basically certainty about how everything will unfold is very similar to death in some sense. Like, it really isn't a full and exciting experience of being alive. So we very perverse the way we sort of embrace all these techniques that seem to promise total control. Lucky for us, they don't work.
Yeah, and that was the exact example I heard you speak with. I think it was Peter Attia on that when you were in Brooklyn, and because I remember when I became an entrepreneur and I became more structured, because
Right.
you have to when you get started, and you figure out that, okay, I have my time, I have to time box, I have to do all these things. But
Yeah.
then when I want to go to the gym in the middle of the day, I create this imaginary box, telling myself that I can't do it when I actually can, and if I feel like I should,
Right.
I should go and do it. But we create
Right.
these rules for ourselves that we don't necessarily need to be there. And I feel for a lot of people that pay attention to your work, we feel like we have to go through pain in order for something to be meaningful. And it
Right.
doesn't really need to be that way. How have you been able to, is it a perspective shift, or like, how have you been able to overcome that, or at least deal with that in
Yeah,
a
I
better
mean,
way?
it is generally with me, it's very gradual. What I tend to do, I think this is quite typical, is I tend to have like these amazing sudden intellectual insights, but then it takes like months and years to actually live into a different way of doing it. Like, you can think what you like on a park bench in Brooklyn, but then you got to like, do the slow work of changing. I think the point you make there is a really good one. It's not that actually, it's not the sort of strictness of the schedule that is the problem. And absolutely, if you leave college or you leave a regular job to become an entrepreneur, self-employed, like, there's a good argument for sort of giving yourself structure, and because you're not going to get it from anywhere else. It's really the idea that then what happens is suddenly you look up and like the structure is in charge of you instead of
Hmm.
you in charge of the structure. And actually, if going to the gym would be the wisest thing to do right now, you should go, even if it clashes with the the structure. And I think this sort of speaks to a general point that I make in the new book about like rules should serve life. Like it's not the point to like for your life to serve a bunch of rules. In terms of that idea as well that you talked about, that we tend to confuse effort with value. We think that like if something is really hard and painful, it must be worth doing, and if something is worth doing, it must be going to be really hard and painful. And there's a lot of that about in the personal development space at the moment. Maybe I'm sort of just asking never to get invited on like Jocko Willink's podcast by saying things like this. I don't know. But like, that's fine if that's your thing. But like this idea that life is fundamentally like a battle against temptation and a battle in favor of discipline, I feel like that has not served me. And I write in the book about this notion, which, has some good defenders. Tim Ferriss is famous for saying this as well, right? This question, like, what would this look like if it were easy? Or in Elizabeth Gilbert's phrase, like, can you dare to be willing to let something be easy? If you want to do something, launch a business, give the opposite example, like, what do you think about if you think like, what if this turned out to be way easier than I'm expecting? Because again, I think the kind of people drawn to it are more likely to feel like, okay, I'm going to put it's discipline, it's effort, it's pain, and if you're already in that category, then it's probably the case that easing up on that is wiser. I mention in the new book an old book by a New Age writer called Julia Rogers Hamrick. Kind of like the continuum of personal development writers has Jocko Willink on one extreme and her on the other, basically. Like this book is like so unlike anything to do with, and it's called Choosing Easy World. And it's an old book, and she sort of makes this argument that her life sort of changed when she suddenly just realized that whenever she was facing a challenge, she could just like choose to live an easy world where everything is easy. And at first, like everything in me is just like, oh, give me a break, right? You can't just like affirmation yourself into things being easy. It's hard to do hard work. And the answer, actually, yes and no, right? There's something very powerful I found about really thinking, okay, I'm going to go and do this thing in easy world. I'm going to live in easy world. And it doesn't mean challenges don't happen. It doesn't mean everything is incredibly simple. It could be very complex. But it does mean you're not bringing this extra kind of, you're not going into the day like braced for a fight, which just causes it to feel like a fight. And it's all to do with weird issues of self-esteem and stuff. It's like, oh, I only feel like I really did my best if it hurt or something. Well, that's something that's worth trying to get over, I think, because it could be that you can be very accomplished and also have fun, and that would be the holy grail, really.
Why can't there be an and, right? Why can't it be both? I mean, we go into this life, again, creating rules for ourselves or having these beliefs that just simply don't serve us. And when I spoke with Derek Sivers, probably last year, I think he's writing his new book now is Useful, Not True. It's like taking on beliefs that are useful for us. They may not be true. Eventually they could be true if we take them on as true, and we can, give us some proof to reinforce it. But I think a lot of the time our suffering really isn't, it's self-inflicted in a way, and the belief that something has to be hard could even make it hard.
Yeah, and another way of talking about what Derek's talking about there, I think, is that famous quote. I forget who said it originally, but like somebody said, the opposite of a great truth is also a great truth, right? So life is difficult, and it's really good to be able to surrender to that fact. It's also true that life is easier than you assume. And there are lots of these cases where I'm like, someone might say like, but didn't you argue the opposite in that other place? And I'm like, yeah, probably. Right. It's like, that's fine. These are tools for engaging more deeply with life. And sometimes one is going to be more appropriate than the other.
In the new book, you said, what is already true, or what is true is already so, owning up to it doesn't make it worse.
Yeah, that's Eugene Gendlin. That's a really great quote. Yeah.
So you've heard the quote, you are the average of the 5 people you surround yourself most with, right? Well, that's more true than you could possibly imagine. And what if those 5 people were a human lie detector, an FBI negotiator, an ex-CIA spy, a billionaire, and everything in between? Well, that's exactly what I've been able to do with my podcast over these past few years. From starting in my car with no money, no experience, no following, not even a microphone, and now I'm collaborating with some of the most profound individuals in the world. And it's because of 2 simple things: crafting the perfect pitch so that when the person sees the message, they are open to actually entertaining the opportunity of speaking with you. And number 2, finding a way to get that pitch seen to begin with so that you actually can get in that room. And if you want to learn the skills and how I've been able to get the guests that I've been able to get in my show without any kind of audience or experience, the link in the description will be there for Get Your Guest, my course, and how I've been able to collaborate and connect with some profound individuals and show you how you can too. Getting things done by not being mean to yourself, like that essential idea in itself. And a lot of people are really, really bad at it, I think.
Yeah. And like me too, and that's why I've been interested in it and had to struggle with it and maybe got some insights into it. Yeah, and that quote is from a blog post by Susan Piver, who's a meditation teacher and who wrote this great post years ago now, that I quote all the time, about how, she was someone who tried to really sort of schedule herself through the day and say, I will meditate from 5:30 to 6:30. I will have breakfast from 6:30 to 7:15. I will journal from 7, and finding that usually what happened was that she fell off schedule, felt bad about it, and did much less than if she'd, this made things worse because she ended up just like lying on the couch watching TV or whatever. And just occasionally she managed to get through the whole schedule, and then all you think is like, okay, now I've got to do that every single day. And so it's not exactly a recipe for low stress. And then she writes about just experimenting with this question, like, what do I want to do? Like, what would bring me pleasure to do? And she writes that, her first reaction to that was fear, because it's that sense that a lot of us have, I think, that like, if I just do what I want to do, I'm just going to like be a total, like, I'm just going to waste time. I'm not going to get around to any of the things that I want to do, really want to do in my life and career. And yet, of course, she found, and I can attest to this in my own experiments with it, that that's not true, right? It's like, if you want to build a business, if you want to get fit, if you want to be well read, whatever it is, then at some point it's going to be the thing that you feel like doing. And the more that you trust that sort of question, what do I feel like doing, the more that the answer will be something, important and productive and good. It won't just be slacking off. And it's such a kind of radical question for a lot of us, right? That sort of, but I can't just do what I want. Like that can't be how it works. But again, I think it's a real, it's one of those tools that is really useful for a certain kind of person. Now, just to go back to that question of how the opposite can, the point about how the opposite can also be true. There's another section in this book on the Jungian idea of a life task and asking yourself, what's the life task in any given?
Do it.
Sorry,
You beat me
to
it.
You're going to ask me about that?
Yeah, just really quick, the James Hollis quote, and it something that enlarges you rather than making you feel immediately happy. But go right to it.
Right. So yeah, he's talking about James Hollis, Jungian therapist, great guy. He's talking about this question you can ask yourself when you're facing a choice in life or something like that, about like, is the path I want to choose one that will enlarge me rather than diminish me? Instead of, will this make me happy rather than sad? Because, we're terrible at predicting what will make us happy, but you can connect to a sort of an intuitive sense of, oh yeah, growth lies in this direction. And that can very often be a difficult path, right? It can be long hours creating something from scratch. It can be feeling very emotionally vulnerable in a new relationship, making a commitment to a relationship in a way that scares you, right? So what I'm saying there, just to contradict myself before, is that, there are times when what life is asking of you is is not to do what you want, what you sort of want in that short-term sense, but something that is the right thing for you to do. And there are other times when asking like, what do I want to do right now is really powerful. So it's not like one of these is right and one of these is wrong. If you're a commitment phobe and you're asking, do I want to commit to this relationship, then you're probably never going to want to do that. So it's time to ask, would it enlarge me to do this or not? If on the other hand, you're the kind of person who like is sitting there miserably working through a to-do list of 100 items because you've decided that's what success is based on, and it's getting harder and harder to make any progress because each one feels like lifting a heavy weight, well, that's a time to ask, what do I want to do right now?
Yeah, a lot of self-improvement knowledge, and yours is a part of this too, is so paradoxical. Like
Right.
there is no right answer nor wrong answer to anything that we do. It's I think a lot of it is just taking a different perspective on things. And as a writer yourself, what are common questions that you continuously ask yourself when you catch yourself kind of needing your own work, I guess?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know how typical I so in some ways writers are always writing about writing, and it's kind of,
Mhm.
you know, I can imagine it's pretty annoying to people who have no interest in writing. But writing is a very good model for, I think, for a lot of self-directed knowledge work, and obviously almost all of that work involves some writing. I'm maybe even less typical in a way because I'm writing sort of advice stuff. So I am very much writing the advice that I need to hear. That's sort of how I judge whether I think it's worth writing about, is like, is this something that either is making or could make or has made a difference to me in my work, which sounds kind of self-absorbed, but actually I think it is the best way to create stuff that is of value to other people. I don't know if this is the question you were particularly getting at, but it's what it makes me think of, is like, after 4,000 weeks did kind of better than I was expecting it to do. I got into this completely predictable thing, right? Which is, I sort of froze up when it came to trying to write something new, because now I was thinking like, oh my God, now it's got to be as successful as the last one, which, by the way, it absolutely might not be. Like, of course it might not be. It's totally, it's all a probability game. And also, like, if I screwed up, more people would be watching, so it would be more humiliating or something, and all that usual perfectionistic nonsense. And it took me a while to realize that, like, oh yeah, this is the thing that I'm writing about here. This thing about being willing to sort of prioritize real creation in reality over perfect creation in theory. And for me, one of the stages of that in writing this new book was, there was a time there where I was doing all these kinds of free writing exercises where you set a timer for half an hour and just write anything into a file. And I used to hate this stuff, because to me that was always like, on some level that was for amateurs, right? On some level that was just stupid, just writing anything that came into your head and then cleaning it up.
Mhm.
But of course, what I realized was that my real aversion to it was not that it's for amateurs. My real aversion to it was that it involved giving up more control. The real problem with writing anything that comes to mind for half an hour without stopping is that you make a mess. And if you're sort of a neat freak and a perfectionist and you want to only put things down on the page that are good, then that is really feels very unpleasant. But it is the first stage, I think, to better writing. And for me, it was, I had to be willing to do that. And it really does, it was very powerful, but it really required me to spend a number of days like thinking like, what the hell am I doing? It's like, I don't need to do all this nonsense, but apparently I did.
I think Mark Manson had a similar experience when he wrote his last book, and it was a really difficult thing for him because he thought that it would give him everything he was looking for, and then it didn't really give him anything because he'd already written other books. It was just this one had a lot more attention than all the other ones. And
Yeah.
in your new book, you spoke about kind of procrastination. I think procrastination and perfectionism go hand in hand, because the reason that you're doing either one is usually from the source is, which is you are trying to avoid encountering your limitations or your fears or your judgments about yourself. And that is the core of what that really seems to be. There isn't a specific tactic that can really help you overcome that. I mean, there are things that you can do, of course, but at the end of the day, you have to get past your own fears, it seems.
Yeah, I think, I think tactics and tools are very helpful, but they're sort of vehicles for a particular realization, a particular insight.
Yeah.
They're not like silver bullets. And the insight in question is that nothing you bring into the world can be as perfect as how you think it ought to be. And this is just true by definition. And one of the ways I've put this in the past I find really helpful is like, a million people, self-help gurus tell you you've got to be willing to fail, right? That's like the cliche, the biggest cliche in the world. You've got to be willing to fail. But I think what perfectionists need to hear is like, you've already failed. It's like, it's already too late to live a life with a perfect track record. It's already too late to produce only perfect work or any perfect work. And the moment you sit down at your computer to write a novel, the moment you sit down at your computer to launch a business, whatever it is, the ship has already sailed of doing it perfectly. It's like, it's off the table. And I find that really powerful and liberating because, again, then you don't need to worry about that. Then you don't need to hold yourself to that standard. And for me, that is associated with a much greater willingness to actually act. I mean, I still fall into that problem all the time, and I'll be like, why can't I get started on this piece of writing? And it's like, oh, yes, it's because some little perfectionistic part of me has come back and is trying to tell me that, like, this is going to be the piece, the article that blows everyone out of the water, or this is going to be the one that really nails this idea that I've been trying to nail. And, some kind of absolutist internal demand that just needs to be seen for what it is so that it can be kind of ignored, really.
I really like that perspective. I don't think I've heard anyone really frame it that way. It's the embracing your limitations mindset that everyone feels as though if I embrace my limitations, I'm settling for less, or I'm not being optimistic enough, or I'm not thinking big enough,
Right.
whatever that thought is. But it's just not the way. It's not the way that you're trying to frame things, and I don't think people can conceive that enough because it is really difficult for people to understand.
And soon enough, someone listening to that will say, like, oh, so you're just saying we shouldn't aim to do the most interesting and exciting things? And I'm
Right.
like, no, absolutely not. This is the way to do the
Yeah.
most interesting and exciting things. And actually, stop me if you want to talk about something else, but something in the book that relates to the title of your podcast, I think, is that whole thing on I don't know if you've seen the chapter called "C'est fait pas du monde," which is
Last part.
a French Canadian. Sorry.
It's in the end of the book a little bit, or
Right,
like
right. It's a French Canadian phrase that some guy online attributed to his grandmother. Like, the source is very
right.
murky and has resisted my attempts to sort of nail it down precisely. But it translates roughly as like, people did that, and this is a thing that this person's grandmother would say when you sort of if you express like awe and amazement at some scientific achievement or business achievement or whatever it might be. Everything you see around you that was, except like the natural environment, was made by limited, imperfect people. And so you're not actually, literally everything, the wonders of the world, people did that. Some of them may have had special talents, absolutely. I'm not suggesting that anyone can, become a genius mathematician or a chess grandmaster or something, but the basic idea that, when you acknowledge that perfection is not something you're going to produce, when you acknowledge that any creative work you put into the world is already flawed at its birth by comparison to the things that you're imagining in your head, you are not at that point ruling out any level of success, right? Your novel could still be as successful as Stephen King's or Leo Tolstoy's, right? I mean, it might or might not be, separate question, but the fact that it's imperfect doesn't prevent that, because actually every single thing you see around you was made by people who are finite, people who are incapable of total perfection in anything they do, because it was made by humans.
Yeah, that is definitely such a massive part of the podcast, was that thought. I think of it even like, I don't know how a computer works. I could not tell you that what's inside of my computer, but I'm able to speak with you right now. And that blows
Right.
me away that humans can do that. Think of the pyramids. I don't think maybe humans didn't do that, honestly, but you never know. Um, yeah, I think it's fascinating to think about what we can do when we drop the idea. We don't hold it so much in our mind of like this perfect idea of it, but we just get into action. As you stated earlier, when we first started the podcast, action seems to be the thing that most people struggle with. I mean, whether it's getting started or continuously taking action, there's 4 weeks from the new book right now. What do you feel from those 4 weeks? What week do you think most people struggle with, or what like idea?
Yeah, so just because people won't necessarily know, the structure of this book is that it's 28 short chapters divided into 4 weeks, and the idea is that there's something quite useful about doing one per day. Like, obviously, I can't force anyone to do that,
Hard
and they
to
can
do.
read it
Hard to do.
however they want. But there is some benefit in that sort of being patient with it. I think there's something quite powerful about that. And anyway, it doesn't matter. But the 4 weeks kind of build on each other. And, it's hard to say which one is the biggest challenge, but the first week is called Being Finite, and that's just about sort of facing the truth of our limited time, energy, attention, control. Second one is called Taking Action, and it's about, making things happen in the world as a finite human. The third one is called Letting Go, and it's more about the very important role of letting things happen and sort of not getting too much in the way of a productive and fulfilling and enjoyable life, which is possibly the hardest one, or the hardest one it has been for me. The awareness that sometimes you really sort of stand out of the way, and that's where if I recall correctly, that's where the section on allowing things to be easy is placed, because again, that's more something you need to sort of let happen, something you need to allow, instead of something you need to kind of make happen aggressively. And then the fourth week is called Showing Up, and it's sort of the culmination of this, right? It's this idea that what you're getting out of all this, if it resonates with you, is a greater intensity of like being alive. It's a greater sense of like really being here and really relishing this brief existence that we have. And ultimately, I think that's got to be the point of any of this, right? I mean, if you're not getting to the point of feeling alive, then why are you doing all these productive things? So to me, they're all very, very interlinked. That sort of 4 week progression. But yeah, I guess if I'm talking about myself, I would say it's that allowing phase is certainly one I've found more challenging than the sort of willpower driven spirit of the second week in the book.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. When we, again, it goes back to, I mean, really the core of your work isn't so much productivity, but it's more so controlling what you can control, doing what you can do, and then embracing the limitation of what you can't, and not in a pessimistic way, but just a more realistic way to live a more fulfilled, joy-filled life. And
somebody said to me the other day in an email, "Isn't this just Stoicism?" And somebody else is like, "Isn't this just Zen Buddhism?" And I'm like, yeah, basically. But I think, it's some combination of the above. And I think that's totally fine, right? I mean, we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. I'm just trying to express these ideas in a way that maybe meets the sort of moment that we're at in the world. But a lot of it is Stoicism and Zen when it comes to these issues.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything is regurgitated from somewhere. So it's not like there's no one's really making new ideas here. We're just packaging it in a different way. And like I said with you, or for me, you packaged it very, very, very well. I'm curious, from this book, from the last book, is there something that you learned about yourself from this book, the writing process? Because I feel the book that we get the most from isn't the one that we read, but it's usually the one that we write, at least from a lot of the authors that I've been able to speak to. Is there something that you've learned about yourself from this new book?
Yeah, I've found repeatedly with the books I've written that I sort of have to, the pattern is that I get some idea and I'm like, oh yeah, I sort of road test it and talk to people and then write a book proposal. It's like, it's a good idea, but now you got to write the book. And the process of writing the book really involves, in some way, like changing who I am so that I can actually embody what I'm saying. So in the case of 4,000 Weeks, the idea didn't really change, the fundamental idea from the very beginning to the end of it. But the reason it was quite grueling to write in certain ways was because it was almost like I had to become more willing to make tough choices with time, more willing to be patient, like just in order to get the book to get written. So it's almost supernatural. I mean, I don't understand it, but it's like the book will guide you, or in my case, I find the book will guide you in the sort of changes you need. And in this case of Meditations for Mortals, the new book, it's it was very much to do with like letting go of oppressive external standards, letting go of needing people to like the result, letting go of the fear that other people will be disappointed in, all that sort of self-worthy kind of stuff, that layer of the ongoing process of public therapy that I pursue through writing books. And so yeah, I sort of, it got to the point where unless I was willing to be more like that, I wasn't going to get the words on the page. So I have found, and I think this is quite widespread actually, including for people who are not professional writers but who write in journals and things, there is something really powerful about writing in terms of how it relates to personal change. And I certainly find, yeah, I'll come up with a good idea for a book of advice I need to hear, and then I actually need to sort of turn into the person who's taken that advice in order to get the book finished.
Yeah, you spoke a lot about that in the new book of not trying to be a specific person, but just doing the thing to become that kind of person. We get away from it. It's like our void in a way.
Right. There's a quote at the beginning from Marion Woodman, the Jungian psychologist. It is easier to try to be better than you are than to be who you are. And in a way, that sort of sums it up for me, right? I mean, in a way, this book is about, and my experience of writing the book is about sort of what it really means to step more wholeheartedly into who you are and what you're capable of, instead of trying to sort of progress up some metric you're holding in your head, at the top of which you'd finally get to say, I have justified my existence on the planet. I'm finally an adequate human being, or something like that.
And there's going to be probably a lot of things that come up for you when I ask this question, but is there something that you believed at the beginning of your career that you no longer believe in?
I mean, the one sort of very obvious to me that springs to mind is, because it sort of goes through everything I write about, is that belief in the kind of future moment of truth. The idea that I would get to a point in the future where, like, I knew what I was doing and I didn't have to deal with all sorts of problems and crises every day, and I felt like I was never had to say no to anybody in a way that I didn't like doing. And sort of realizing that time is never coming is actually really powerful, because it's like, oh, well, if I'm never going to get rid of problems, if I'm never going to get to this moment where I'm like, now I'm in full control, then you can actually live much more interestingly and productively right now, instead of waiting for that time. So I think that has been quite important for me. In a weird way, it went in the other direction as well, right? I think when I first began writing, especially about self-help and personal development, I was a big cynic, and I sort of thought, this whole field is rubbish and it's fun to poke fun at it. And actually, I went on a sort of journey towards more sincerity and thinking like, oh, there's some decent stuff in here, and you need to take it seriously. But yeah, I think that idea that there's an end point to any of this. I mean, obviously, there's an end point to life that is sadly unavoidable. But I think I'm much more relaxed with the idea that I'm on a sort of ongoing, endless journey of interesting stuff and inner work, and even just things like productivity techniques. It's like, it's cool. I love experimenting with new productivity techniques. But what I no longer think is that I'm going through these experiments in a desperate bid to find the one that is going to make everything okay. Now it's just like, sure, there's a new app, I'll experiment with it. That'll be fun. Fine, whatever. But it's not salvation.
You said in the new book, our suffering is in believing there is a way out. And that's essentially, I mean, so much of your work really is just, like you said, it's the kayak example is the best example of the progression of life in itself.
That quote, "Our suffering is believing there's a way out," is from Mel Weitzman, the American Zen teacher, and I think it's like you get that idea again and again and again, especially in Zen, but not only, that you think the issue in your life is that you haven't found a solution to the problem that you face, which could be any number of different things, and you might not even be clear on what it is. Might be a problem with you, might be a problem with your environment or your bank balance. For some people, it's a problem with like the political environment or something. You think the problem is that you haven't found the solution yet, but the problem is that you think there ought to be a solution and that you could get to a solution. And when you can let go of that, at least a little bit, you can really be much more present in life, because it's like, oh, okay. I think this is really interesting in the way people talk about politics. Just a mere quick aside, people often talk from whatever side of the spectrum they're on. They talk as if like politics is going to, they talk as if it's going to stop. Like they talk as if like if they can just make sure their candidate gets elected at the next election, then everything's going to be fine. And it's like, it's never going to end. Time just keeps on unfolding, and you're always going to have a new political problem to address, and you're always going to have new challenges in your personal life, and you're always going to have new things you want to be doing in your business life. You're never going to get to the end of all that. I mean, except that death is coming for all of us. And it's so relaxing to really plunge into that without this background agenda of like, I've got to get to the place where I've solved the problem of human existence.
Yeah, it's the something that I tell myself often is problems replace problems. So whatever problem I'm dealing with, like, sure, I want to solve it, but then there's something else going to be replaced with it, and then replaced with that. I think this relates a little bit to productivity debt as well, where we feel we have to justify our existence by solving these problems that we have of the day. When it's like the idea of like being more productive doesn't get you to the end of your problems or your tasks, but only just opens you up to do more and continue that task going on. And I think a lot of people deal with productivity debt not really even knowing that concept. When I heard it, it really resonated with me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm that phrase for me just I use to imply that sense of like you got to pay off a debt of tasks each day, otherwise you don't feel like you really have been a real reasonable human being. And in fact, actually you don't need to earn your right to exist. The reason to do tasks through the day is because hopefully they're cool projects that you want to do, not because you have to sort of plug some inner void. And yeah, I like the way, problems replace problems. Exactly right. There's that Haitian proverb that I quote in the book: beyond the mountains, more mountains,
Yes.
which is sort of brilliantly depressing. I kind of, maybe this is a British attitude as well. I don't know, but and you can certainly hope for better problems, like
For sure.
and more interesting problems and less scary problems, but don't make the mistake of hoping for no problems at all. I don't think that would be a good life anyway.
Yeah, I think it's choosing the problems that you want to deal with. But again, that's with the assumption that you can control what problems that come and arrive in your life. But yeah, man, Oliver, I thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. There's one last question I ask every guest,
Yep.
encapsulates kind of what I want to do. But what belief are you currently unlearning?
Well, I think I'm currently unlearning the belief that obligation in life is more important than enjoyment. I think I'm unlearning or trying to unlearn the idea that, you know, meeting external standards and doing what's expected of me is what really matters, and that doing what is enjoyable and sort of makes me feel most alive is secondary. I'm trying to switch those.
I'm with you on that. And that's, again, why I resonate so deeply with your work. Of course, the new book and all your links will be in the show notes, but is there anywhere you like to direct people?
Just to the book, wherever you get your books, in whatever format, and my website, oliverburkeman.com.